Alright guys, what's going on? We're back at the computer today, and today we're going to be talking about optimizing exercise selection. I'm going to be doing this a little bit differently than normal. I'm going to be doing it on kind of like a PowerPoint slideshow type thing. Obviously, it's not the most original way to make a video, but to me, it's a pretty comfortable way to do it, and it's pretty easy. And hopefully, it helps you guys understand more what I'm talking about instead of like standing at the blackboard and writing it or something. So, why is this important to optimize your exercise selection within your training session? By having optimal exercise selection, this is going to allow you to make the maximum amount of progress in skeletal muscle hypertrophy, which means making growth, while simultaneously getting the most bang for our buck in terms of time in the gym. Now, why is it important to get the most bang for our buck in terms of time in the gym? We want to be getting the most out of the least amount of time in the gym as possible, because the less amount of time that we're in the gym, the more time that we're outside of the gym, eating, sleeping, and recovering, which means that we're going to be growing bigger and faster. Now, what do we need to understand in order for this to be effective? We can't just go about randomly picking exercises and everything for certain body parts. We have to have a certain amount of background knowledge that we're going to apply in order to make this the most beneficial for us. And I'm going to talk about all of these things in specific as we go on. But the main things that we need to understand is that for the most part, what you see on Instagram is complete bullshit. We need to look at the successes of previous physique athletes and what made them so successful inside the gym. We need to have a basic understanding of human anatomy and physiology, and as well as a slight understanding in human kinesiology. And we also need to understand motor patterns and how we can manipulate them within a training session. All right, for the first thing, Instagram is for the most part bullshit. When you go on Instagram and you look at all these fitness pages, they're plagued with these fitness models or personalities. They're doing random flashy exercises, and they're talking about how they're the next great glute builder, leg builder, chest builder, arm builder, whatever. This is very, very common in the female fitness industry. I don't normally like to think of the fitness industry as like separate between males and females, but this is very, very common within the female industry. Women doing glute exercises and stuff on the Smith machine or on the cable machine, the jungle gym. And while these machines, the Smith machine and the cable rack, they do have their respective purpose within training, for the most part, they're generally poor movements to progressively overload on over time. And progressive overload over time is going to be one of, if not the major contributors to muscle hypertrophy and growth. Next, we need to look at the previous successes of former physique athletes. We need to look at guys like Ronnie Coleman, Dorian Yates, Jay Cutler, Arnold, etc., etc. Down below, I have pictures of Dorian Yates on the left and Ronnie Coleman on the right. The Dorian Yates picture I threw in there because the black and white pictures of Dorian Yates are, in my opinion, like my favorite pictures in all of bodybuilding. Super iconic. Just showcases an absolute freak of nature for his time. Now, we need to look back at these people, and there's tons of footage of these guys training, right? That's on YouTube. They've got their own movies, documentaries, etc., etc. And we have to ask ourselves, were any of these guys doing the shit that you see on Instagram today? And 99% of the time, the answer is no. These guys were doing basic barbell and dumbbell movements, very rarely touched a Smith machine, very rarely touched a cable rack. They were doing everything free weight with barbells and dumbbells, and I think that speaks volumes on the density and thickness of their physiques that they presented on stage. Next, we have to have a basic understanding of human anatomy and physiology. We need to understand what muscles make up the human body, how they contract, and how they work within the body's physiology, how all these muscles work together to allow the main engine of our body to work optimally. And we need to understand the insertions and origin of each muscle in order to know how to manipulate these within training in order to get maximal hypertrophy stimulation with each muscle group. And finally, we have to have a basic understanding of kinesiology and motor patterns. Kinesiology means it's the study of basic human movement. We need to have a basic understanding of the planes or axes of movement, like flexion, extension, rotation, circumduction, etc., etc. We need to understand how these planes work within training. For example, we need to know what flexion means. We need to know what circumduction means. We need to know the difference between abduction and adduction. And finally, motor patterns. And in my opinion, this is probably the most important factor in choosing an exercise, is what motor pattern does the exercise follow, and how can we differentiate that between training. The definition of a motor pattern, for those that don't know, is it's a particular sequence of muscle movements that are directed to accomplishing an external purpose. Now, what this means is different movements follow different motor patterns. And by changing the motor patterns that we use in training, we're able to hit muscles from different angles and stimulate them differently and stimulate the muscle to its full extent. Now, I'm going to use an example of this with everyone's favorite muscle group, the chest. I have a picture here, just kind of some basic muscle anatomy of the chest. On the next slide, I believe, I have a picture of the chest that I'm going to be referencing quite a few times throughout this explanation, because it's very important to understand how each muscle group works, where its insertion, where its origin is, etc., etc., and so we can properly stimulate it in the gym to get the most bang for our buck and get the most growth out of it. Now, the major muscles that are going to lie within the chest are the pectoralis major. There is a major and a minor region. The minor is going to be what we refer to as the upper chest, up closer to the neck. And the major is going to be like the lower chest, slightly below the meat of the chest, I guess you could say. Now, for the chest specifically, we need to understand, remember, basic human anatomy and physiology, the origin and the insertion of the chest. Now, the origin of the chest muscles is going to lie right. I'm going to back out of this because I want you guys to be able to know what I'm talking about. The origin and the insertion of the chest muscles. Let's see, start from current slide. So the origin and insertion of the chest muscles. Our origin is going to be right here in the clavicle, right in the middle of our body. And the insertion of the chest muscles, the pecs, is going to be right here in the humerus, right at the top of our arm, so to say. Now, in order for these muscles, the chest muscles, to properly be stimulated, not just the chest muscles, but all muscles, two things need to happen to the muscle. The muscle needs to be shortened and it needs to be lengthened, which will cause the muscle to contract when it's shortened, and it will cause it to stretch when it's lengthened, okay? So now if we look at the chest, and I don't want you to think of like a pec, I want you to think of 2 points, point A here at the clavicle and point B here at the humerus. Again, I'm going to back out just to make sure that you guys can physically see what I'm pointing at. Okay, we're in a good spot. Shift F5. Okay, so I want you to think of the chest as 2 points. Point A, the origin here in the clavicle, and point B, the insertion here in the humerus. Now, to shorten these 2 points, we need to bring these 2 points closer together. And as these 2 points, point A and point B, they become shortened and they come closer to each other, you can feel the chest muscle, the pec, contract, and it gets closer together, I guess you could say. Now, to lengthen them, we need to take these 2 points, point A and point B, and they need to distance themselves further apart. And as these 2 points distance themselves further apart, you can feel the chest muscle stretch. So in order to stimulate the chest muscles, we need to repeatedly shorten and lengthen these 2 points, the clavicle and the humerus. By shortening and lengthening the clavicle and the humerus over time, we consistently contract and stretch, contract and stretch, contract and stretch the chest muscles under load, under weight, which will cause them to micro tear and break down, and then over time, with diet and recovery, they will grow back stronger to adjust to the stimulus that we placed on them. Now, motor patterns. What are the two motor patterns that we can do when we're talking about the chest muscles? The motor patterns that are going to emphasize contraction, or the shortening of the movement, are going to be our pressing movements. And the movements that exercise or maximize, I guess you could say, the lengthened position are going to be our stretching movements, most commonly flies, push-ups, dips, etc. Now, what are the different variations of these two movements, of the pressing movements and then the stretching movements? Let's go back to the picture that I just showed. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor here as I look at the chest muscle. You'll see the majority of the chest muscle fibers actually run horizontally, left to right. But we see in the upper part of the chest that these particular chest muscles actually run kind of at like a 45-degree angle. And we also see at the lower chest, the lower part of the pec major, we have some fibers that actually run at a 45-degree angle, but the opposite way. So what that tells me is, in order to properly shorten and lengthen the chest muscles, we need to do so from a flat position. The fact that these upper fibers here run at a 45-degree angle from the humerus up to the top of the clavicle, that explains why we need to do incline pressing movements. Because when we do the flat movements, and we're shortening and lengthening, shortening and lengthening, shortening and lengthening, we're hitting these fibers here, the ones in the middle that run completely horizontally. But in order to hit these fibers here, what we need to do is we need to angle our arm at a slight 45-degree angle. Now, by rotating our arm at a 45-degree angle here, shortening and lengthening, shortening and lengthening, shortening and lengthening, now we're hitting these fibers, the fibers that run at a 45-degree angle from the humerus to the clavicle. Likewise, in order to hit these muscle fibers, the ones that run at a 45-degree angle from the humerus down towards the sternum area, we need to angle our arm in the opposite direction and shorten and contract, shorten and contract, shorten and contract. Hopefully you guys can see that. I'm just going to back out and make sure. Okay. So flat movements, shorten and contract, shorten and contract, shorten and contract. Remember, point A and point B. This hits the fibers that run complete horizontally. This will probably be a better angle. As we angle our arm upwards, now we're hitting the fibers that run at a 45-degree angle from our humerus to our clavicle. And as we change our arm to a 45-degree angle the other way, now we're hitting the fibers that run from the clavicle to the sternum. So what that tells me, in order to maximally hit the chest from all different angles, is we need to do incline movements, flat movements, and decline movements. And within those three planes of movement, incline, flat, and decline, we need to shorten and lengthen the muscle within those motor patterns. So we need to be doing flat presses and flat flies, incline presses and incline flies, decline presses and decline flies. Now I have question marks next to the decline here because there's a lot of people that question whether or not the lower chest actually exists and whether or not we need to do decline movements. There are some fibers, as we can tell by this picture here, there are some fibers in the chest that run from the humerus down to the sternum. So in order to maximally hit the chest, we do need to do some decline movements. However, I'm not a big fan of decline presses and decline flies. In my personal opinion, I think that dips are going to perfectly suffice for the only decline movement that you're really going to need to do. When you're doing a dip, you're both shortening and lengthening the lower pec fibers. So I don't see a point in doing decline flies and decline presses in order to hit those lower fibers. I think you're going to get the maximal stimulation from them by doing dips. So now that we understand the different variations of motor patterns for the chest, stretches and flies, and the different planes of movement that we need to exercise these movements in, incline, decline, and flat. Now, how do we go about using this information to maximize our exercise selection within a training program? Now, let's take a look at our options for each particular motor pattern and each particular plane of movement. For our flat pressing movement, our main options are going to be barbell bench press, dumbbell bench press, and then some sort of a machine bench press that exercises shortening and lengthening the humerus, um, and clavicle in a flat plane of motion. Incline presses, we have the same choices. We can do presses with barbells, with dumbbells, or we can do machines. For our main flat stretching movement, we can do flat dumbbell flies. Most gyms have a pec deck machine, which is going to allow us to stretch the chest from a flat plane of motion. And we also have the cable machine for the cable flies. For our incline stretching movement, we have the same options. We have the dumbbell flies. Not a lot of gyms have like an incline fly machine, but we do have cable flies where you can wheel a bench up in an incline position and do them kind of low to high to kind of hit your upper fibers. And then for decline movements, I said dips, but you can also do a high positioned cable fly. If you set the, I'm going to back out here and make sure that you guys can see this. If you have a cable fly machine and you set the handles very high, what you can kind of simulate a dip where you're hitting the lower fibers of your chest. But for the most part, I really think that dips are going to be your best option there. You can put a belt on and add some weight to it, so you can get weighted dips. I really think that weighted dips are going to be the best movement for your decline flies. So now, what your goal is as an athlete is to pick one movement out of all of these. And the way that we go about picking that movement is you're going to pick the movement that best lends itself to progressive overload and it feels the best for you. Now what does this mean? What does progressive overload mean? Your barbell benches and your dumbbell benches, your free weight movements are always going to be the best movements for progressive overload. The rare exception where this happens is like in my gym, for example. The heaviest dumbbells that are in my gym are 100 pounds. And I can do flat dumbbell bench with the 100-pound dumbbells for like 10 reps. So in order for me to continue to progressively overload the flat dumbbell bench, I need to be doing more reps with the 100s. I need to start getting reps of 13, 14, 15. I hate going up into those really high rep ranges. I think the majority of muscle breakdown and size and strength gains happen in the 6 to 10 rep range. So for me, flat barbell bench is going to be my number one movement for flat presses, because in theory, I can add as much weight as I want to the barbell, and it will, I'll essentially never run out. Obviously, there is a point where like you put like 8 or 9 plates on the barbell and you can no longer add weight, but there's nobody that's ever going to reach that on a flat barbell bench, so that's kind of obsolete. With the incline pressing movement, right now I'm kind of at a point where I'm hitting the 90s or so for like 6 to 8 reps. So I'm sticking with incline dumbbell bench until I can max out those 100s, and then I'll probably move back into incline barbell bench for the same. So I'll be doing two. At the moment, I'm doing one flat barbell press and one incline dumbbell press, but eventually, once I get to maxing out the incline dumbbells, I'll be doing two barbell pressing movements. Now for the flat stretching movement, I'm a big fan of the pec deck personally. The cable machine in my gym is kind of shitty, and that the handles are very, very wide apart. So instead of pulling my chest back and stretching it, I feel like it pulls my arms out and I get a lot of stress in the shoulder. So I don't like to do a lot of cable flies in my gym. I like to do a lot of the flat pec deck flies. But I train in a YMCA in like a very small town. So if you live in a nice town that has a nice gym with nice equipment and your cable fly machine feels great, then go ahead and do your cable flies. So for me, my flat stretching movement is the pec deck fly. Now my incline stretching movement, again, I just talked about how my cable flies, the cable machine at my gym is kind of not that great. So I choose to do the dumbbell flies for my incline stretching movement. And then for my decline movement, I'm always going to pick my dips. So at the moment, my current chest routine is flat barbell bench, incline dumbbell bench, pec deck flies, incline dumbbell flies, and dips. And now, once you've picked your exercises for each particular motor pattern, what you need to ask yourself is, if this is the only chest routine that I could follow for the rest of my life, would I be okay with that? And the answer for me at the moment is yes. Like I think of each motor pattern, and for the flat barbell press, I think there is no better movement for me at the moment than flat barbell bench. For the incline pressing movement, I think at the moment there is no better movement for me than the incline dumbbell bench. For the flat stretching movement, I think for me at the moment, there's no better option than the pec deck fly, etc., etc., as you go down the line. So now if you ask yourself, if this is the only chest routine that I could follow for 15 years, would that be okay with me? And the answer is no. You need to figure out what movement isn't agreeing with you, and you need to replace it with one that is. So now that you have your chest routine in place, now what do we do? What you need to do is you need to do the same exact chest routine every chest day for an extended period of time. I'm talking like 6 months. One of the biggest, how do I want to say this? The best progress that myself and a lot of my clients have made is when they follow the same program for months at a time. And all they do is they focus on getting better at the movement and progressively overloading it over time. What that means is, now here's an example of this. If you start a program on January and you are benching 185 pounds for 6 reps, and that 6th rep is, you take it to failure, there's no way that you could get another rep. And in March, you can now bench 205 pounds for 6 reps to failure. What you've effectively done is you've added 20 pounds of tension and torque to the chest muscles. You're taking the set to failure, so you're not leaving any gas in the tank. And you're hitting 205 for 6 reps, and 2 months ago you were hitting 185 for 6 reps. Same amount of reps, but 20 pounds more. So not only are you physically stronger, but your chest is going to grow in order to reflect this. I'm sick and tired of people, I'm going to rant for a second. I'm sick and tired of people trying to explain that training for strength and size are not the same exact thing, unless you are specifically training as a powerlifter to try and hit PRs in the 1 to 3 rep range. But if you're getting stronger in, I would say, the 5 to 8 rep range, you are going to, your chest, your legs, your back is going to get stronger to reflect that. So if there are people that are squatting 225 for sets of 20 because the weight on the bar doesn't matter and it's all about squeezing and getting a pump, you're totally missing out on the maximum amount of gains that you could get because you're not progressively overloading and getting stronger over a period of time. I'm not going to make this video about progressive overload. I plan on making a video at some point in the future about progressive overload and why making an effort to get stronger in the gym is going to get you the best results. Obviously, this video is on exercise selection, but how that ties together is by taking that chest routine that you picked from the previous slides, doing that every chest day for 6 to 12 months, writing down in your phone the weights that you're using and the reps that you're getting with those weights, and aiming to get stronger over time. If you're benching 205 pounds and you hit it for 5 reps, and 2 months later you're still benching 205 pounds and you're hitting it for 5 reps or 6 reps, you have not made any progress in those 2 months, and your chest probably has not grown to reflect that. You need to be making a conscious effort to get stronger and stronger over time, and in order to allow the muscles to reach new stimuluses that they've never felt before, so that they can grow and respond accordingly. So now that we kind of have a basic understanding of motor patterns, and I specifically use the chest to explain, I want to talk about another particular section of the motor patterns. Now, motor patterns are also going to affect specific minute aspects of training. And the most common application that I use this for is going to be your foot stance or your foot width on your quad movements. So similarly to how I use the chest as an example, now I'm going to be using the quads as an example for this. So as we look at the quads, the quadriceps, right, the front of your leg, the beef of your leg, the anatomy and physiology of the quad muscles, the quadriceps, they originate at the femur, which is going to be right around the hip here, and at the top of your leg, and they insert at the tibia, right below the knee. So you can see these big muscles here, they start at the hip, around the femur, obviously right at the hip joint, and they insert right below the knee. So what does this mean? From a kinesiology standpoint, what this means is that the quadriceps work to extend the knee and flex the hip. So now that we know that the quads work anatomically through anatomy to extend the knee and flex the hip, how do we manipulate that within training? By knowing that the quads work to flex the knee, or excuse me, flex the hip and extend the knee, we can conclude that the best muscles for quad activation work to extend the knee, like a leg extension, and flex the hip, like the squat variations. So all we need to do to build a good set of quads is do movements that extend the hip, or extend the knee, and flex the hip. All we need to do to build a good set of quads is do squats and leg extensions. Is that it? Now, no, that's really not it, obviously. But we can dive deeper into this by looking at something that appears on the surface to be minute and not important, like the foot width and the foot stance of your quad movements. So now, let's look at a common quad training routine and see how we can alter this and how we can nitpick it. If you talk about a common quad workout, if someone were to go into the gym and they're going to say, I'm just going to totally annihilate my quads today, what movements would they do? They would probably start off with a squat, whether they do it in the Smith machine or a free weight barbell. That's obviously up to the trainee and the individual, but we know that the squat works to flex the hip. Next, they're going to probably move on to a leg press or a hack squat. These two movements, the order of them can change. Either way, both of these movements work to flex the hip. And then finally, they'll probably warm up with extensions, and they'll probably finish with extensions, because this is obviously the number one movement to extend the knee. That's why leg extensions are so great, is because you're literally sitting in place, extending the knee over and over under load. So we have three movements that work to flex the hip, and we have one movement that works to extend the knee. Now, what are the similarities that are more than likely going to occur between the squat, leg press, and the hack squat? Excuse me. All three of these movements, more than likely, they're going to be using a shoulder width stance. For squatting, it's obviously very common to take a shoulder width stance. Leg press, it's obviously just as common to take a normal width stance, maybe slightly narrower, and then hack squats as well. So what does this mean? We are doing three different movements, and all three of them are doing the same thing. They're working to flex the hip, and they're done in the same motor pattern with a shoulder width stance. So what does this mean? We are using three different apparatuses, a free weight barbell, a leg press, and a hack squat machine, to repeat the same motor pattern, a shoulder width hip flexion movement, and we are repeating it 3 times. We're repeating it over and over and over again. And when you look at these three movements, a squat, a leg press, and a hack squat, and you do all three of those movements with a shoulder width stance, there is no difference between these three movements. What you're doing is you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. The body doesn't understand whether you're doing the machine or you're doing the movement with a free weight barbell, whether a machine is doing it, whether a leg press sled is doing it. All it knows is the motor patterns that are being sent into the quad muscles. They understand that from a shoulder width stance position, you're working to flex the knee over and over and over again. So now that we know that these three movements are essentially the same exact thing, a shoulder width hip flexion movement, how can we nitpick this and make it better? What we need to do is pick one exercise per motor pattern, maximize it, and then move on to the next motor pattern. We need to not repeat the same motor pattern 3 times in a row. So how do we fix this? What we can do is we can fix the foot stance or the foot width on all three of the movements. For example, we can squat with a foot stance that is wider than shoulder width, and then we could go into a shoulder width leg press and then do a hack squat with a narrower shoulder width stance. So all three movements are working to extend the hip, but they're different because all three movements have a different foot stance. We start with the squat with a fairly wide stance, and then we get narrower with the leg press, and then we get even narrower with the hack squat. Yes, all three movements are working to flex the hip, but all three of them are taken with a different foot stance, which is going to send a different motor pattern to the body, which is going to affect different areas of the quadricep muscles, because remember the quads, if you know anything about basic human anatomy and physiology, the quads aren't just one muscle. They're a set of 4 or 5 muscles that are located on the leg. And by taking different foot stances and foot widths, we emphasize different areas of those 4 or 5 muscle groups. Or another way to fix this is if you just cannot squat with I know some people, for example, that when they take a very wide stance with the squat, it's very uncomfortable. So they could squat with the shoulder width stance, and then once they get to the leg press, they could do the leg press unilaterally, one leg at a time, and then they could go to the hack squat where they take a narrower stance. And what you'll also be doing in that situation is doing the same kinesiology plane of movement, flexing the hip, but you're going to be doing it in 3 different ways: with a wide stance, a shoulder width stance, and then a narrower shoulder width stance, or a shoulder width stance, one leg at a time, and then a narrower stance. So now what we've done is we've taken the problem, which is using 3 different apparatuses to repeat the same motor pattern 3 times, and we've changed it to use 3 different apparatuses with each one hitting a different motor pattern. The squat with a wide shoulder width stance does not hit the same muscles as a shoulder width stance on the leg press. Or excuse me, a squat with a wider than shoulder width stance does not hit the same muscles as a shoulder width leg press, which also doesn't hit the same movements as a narrow stance hack squat. Because of the different foot stances on all 3 of these exercises, we're hitting different muscles of the quads, and we're hitting the quads from all angles, so to say. There's going to be different musculature recruitment with each motor pattern because of the varied foot stance. And something as simple as foot stance, how wide you're taking, on the surface appears to be very small, and it doesn't seem to make that big of a deal in your squatting, your leg pressing, your hack squatting, etc. But when you start to combine these 3 movements, what you're trying not to do is repeat the same motor pattern over and over and over again. Obviously, I'm using the quads as an example, but all muscle groups are going to be the same way. If you're doing a flat barbell bench press, and then you go do a flat dumbbell bench press, and then you go do a flat machine press, what you're doing is you're doing the same motor pattern, a flat chest press on 3 different machines. What you need to do is think of each motor pattern, think of what is the best movement for this particular motor pattern, get the most out of that motor pattern, and then move on to the next. And that's all you have to do, and then just focus on progressively getting stronger within each motor pattern, and you're going to make gains. It's literally that simple, assuming that you're following a good diet and recovery strategy, right? So just to recap, here's the main bullet points that you need to know. Stop paying attention to Instagram. A lot of the shit that you see on Instagram is completely bullshit and irrelevant. Stick to the basic bare bones movements, barbells and dumbbells, and focus on getting bigger and stronger at each of them. Just focus on progression. Just focus on getting better. If you can bench 225, try to eventually get to bench 275. If you're deadlifting 315, try to eventually get to deadlifting 365. Be consistent. Do the same program every week for months and months and months at a time, and just focus on getting better at that program. And it's literally that simple. You're going to make gains. What happens is usually every time you change an exercise within your workout routine, you have to start over again. So when, say you start off and you're making all this progress, and then you randomly change the movements, now you have to start all over again, instead of just riding the wave, essentially, and continuing to make progress on each of your movements. And the number one thing that you need to realize is stop repeating the same motor pattern multiple times within one training session. Limit your redundancy, maximize each motor pattern, get the most out of one movement in each motor pattern, move on to the next so you can hit that particular muscle group from all different areas, and then repeat it time and time and time and time again. All right? Any questions? Comment, message me on Instagram. I leave my Instagram in the description. Send me an email. I also leave my email in the description. Hope you guys liked it. Take it easy.